A man doesn't leave a marriage or check out of one while still standing in it because of one bad week. He leaves because something specific and real got taken from him, slowly, over years, and nobody ever named it while there was still time to fix it. Today we're naming it. 7 things a marriage actually needs to give a man for him to stay fully in it, not as an obligation, but as the actual foundation everything else is built on. This is Robbin, and this is the Honest Ledger. Today we're covering what a man is entitled to need from a marriage. Communication he doesn't have to decode. Respect he doesn't have to earn twice. Intimacy that isn't a performance review, a real role in his own home, understanding for how he actually processes things, trust instead of management, and a partner invested in the real relationship instead of a fantasy of one. One thing needs to be said clearly, and I'll say it once. These are legitimate needs, not complaints dressed up as needs. And naming them isn't asking for anything unreasonable. Let's open the ledger. The first entry in the ledger is the difference between direct communication and the expectation that he should simply know. A lot of dissatisfaction in relationships gets built on an unspoken assumption that a partner should anticipate a need, recognize what's wrong, and adjust without ever being told directly what the actual ask is. That expectation sets a man up to fail before he's even given the information required to succeed. Men generally operate on what's actually been communicated, what's been said, what's been asked, what's clearly on the table, not on decoded emotional subtext. That's not a deficiency. It's simply how direct communication actually works for most people, and it's worth treating it that way instead of treating it as something to be silently disappointed by. What this costs a man who's expected to read minds is a pattern where frustration builds on one side, distance builds in response, and a conflict gets manufactured entirely out of an expectation he was never given the chance to meet. On the ledger, a man's genuine effort, undermined by information he was never actually given, and a marriage where clarity would have cost nothing and silence costs everything. It's worth saying plainly that this isn't about romance being replaced by transaction. Asking directly for what you need doesn't make the getting of it less meaningful. It just makes it possible in the first place. The second entry is respect. And if there's one thing that erodes a man's investment in a marriage faster than almost anything else, it's this one. Disrespect rarely shows up as one dramatic moment. It shows up small, an eye roll when he's speaking, a correction delivered in front of other people, a dismissal of his opinion before he's finished stating it, requests that arrive with an undertone questioning his adequacy rather than his availability. None of these individually breaks a marriage. The accumulated weight of them does. A man who's chronically disrespected doesn't become more motivated to please. He disconnects, stops sharing what he actually thinks because it'll be dismissed, stops trying because trying only invites more correction. What this costs him is his own willingness to be vulnerable inside the one relationship that's supposed to be safe for it. On the ledger, respect, which functions less like a nicety and more like the actual oxygen a marriage runs on. Remove it gradually enough, and the relationship suffocates slowly, but it suffocates completely. Men who eventually walk out of marriages or check out of them years before anything official happens describe this same thing with remarkable consistency when asked honestly. Not one betrayal, not one fight, but the accumulated experience of feeling like nothing he did was ever quite enough. The third entry is physical intimacy, and specifically what happens when it becomes conditional instead of consistent. For a lot of men, physical connection isn't separate from emotional connection. It's how emotional connection actually gets expressed and maintained. When that connection is withdrawn or made conditional on mood, on behavior, on whether every other need has already been satisfied first, it stops functioning as intimacy and starts functioning as a performance review he might or might not pass on a given day. What this costs him is more than frustration. It's the specific feeling of being unchosen by the person who's supposed to have chosen him most deliberately of anyone in his life. A man who experiences this long enough may stay, may keep providing and showing up structurally, while the actual connection that makes a marriage feel like a marriage quietly dies underneath the arrangement. On the ledger, consistent, genuine intimacy, worth treating as a real investment in the relationship's health rather than a reward dispensed for good behavior. The difference between obligation and genuine presence in this specific area is something most men can feel immediately, even when they can't always articulate it, and that difference matters more to the actual health of a marriage than almost anything else on this list. The fourth entry is purpose. A man's need to feel genuinely useful, needed, and capable inside his own home, not managed and corrected out of every role he might otherwise occupy. There's a specific damaging pattern that shows up when contributions get consistently second-guessed. He assembles something and it's redone. He handles something with the kids and it's corrected. He makes a call and it's challenged. None of it individually catastrophic. All of it together devastating to a man's sense that there's a real, trusted role for him in his own life. What this costs him is engagement itself. A man who can't do anything right in his own home doesn't try harder. He retreats and finds the sense of purpose he's being denied at home somewhere else instead, in his work, in his own pursuits, in anything that lets him actually feel capable again. On the ledger, a real, respected role in his own household, worth protecting deliberately because a man who feels needed there is a man who wants to stay in it. The particular cruelty of this pattern is that it usually comes from a place of genuinely wanting things done well, which makes it easy to miss the cost. Competence and care are not the same thing as ownership, and a man can watch every task in his own home get quietly reassigned or corrected without anyone involved intending harm at all. The fifth entry is understanding how he actually processes things emotionally, instead of measuring his response against a standard built for someone who processes differently. A lot of men manage difficulty by staying focused and calm in the moment, setting the emotional weight aside temporarily rather than expressing it in real time, and returning to it privately once the actual situation has been handled. That's not avoidance, and it's not evidence he doesn't care. It's a genuinely useful response under pressure, and treating his calm as proof of indifference produces conflict that didn't need to exist. What this costs a man whose processing style gets consistently misread is the exhausting experience of being penalized for staying level-headed in exactly the moments that required it. The fix here runs in both directions. If you need him to simply listen rather than solve, tell him that explicitly because his default is to help by fixing, and without the instruction, he'll keep offering the only kind of support he knows how to give. It's worth adding that this isn't a fixed trait immune to growth. A man can absolutely develop a wider emotional vocabulary over time. But the starting point that actually works is curiosity about how he processes things now, not a demand that he immediately process everything the way someone else does. The sixth entry is trust, specifically the difference between being treated as an equal partner and being treated as someone who requires ongoing oversight. There's a familiar pattern in strained relationships where one partner develops a detailed, specific vision for how everything should be done, the household, the decisions, his time, his choices, and gradually starts managing him into compliance with that vision rather than trusting his judgment. It rarely registers to the person doing it as controlling. It registers as organized, as caring, as simply maintaining standards. From his side, it registers as something else entirely. Perpetual supervision, judgment questioned in every domain, partnership replaced by management. What this costs the relationship is the exact outcome the control was meant to prevent. A man who's managed enough stops investing, which then gets read as further proof that he needs managing, and the cycle tightens until there's no real partnership left underneath the arrangement. Breaking that cycle usually starts with tolerating a specific, uncomfortable kind of uncertainty, letting something get done differently than you would have done it, and discovering that different isn't the same thing as wrong. The seventh entry is realistic expectations, and this might be the quietest, most corrosive one on the list because it operates almost entirely underneath conscious awareness. Every relationship carries some vision of what it's supposed to look like, shaped by culture, by other people's curated lives, by stories absorbed long before either person actually met. Reality never fully matches that vision for anyone, and the gap between imagination and the actual ordinary relationship in front of you is where a lot of real damage gets done, not because anything is actually wrong, but because a real person with real strengths and real limitations doesn't match a story written before either of you knew each other. What this costs a man is being held accountable for failing to be a character in someone else's imagined version of the relationship, rather than being appreciated for who he actually is inside the real one. On the ledger, an honest partnership with a real person, worth choosing deliberately over a fantasy that was never actually available to begin with. Most relationships that get described as dead or unsatisfying are, on closer, honest inspection, simply ordinary. And ordinary, tended with real effort and grounded expectations, is where lasting stability actually tends to live. The extraordinary version people are often chasing was rarely available anywhere to anyone in the first place. The eighth entry is the cost of waiting too long to name any of this, because these 7 things rarely disappear all at once. They erode gradually, and the erosion is often invisible from week to week, even while it's very visible over years. A marriage doesn't usually end because of one unmet need. It ends because several of these went unnamed for long enough that the distance became the default state of the relationship rather than a temporary rough patch either person expected to address. By the time it's obvious to everyone involved, a lot of the goodwill required to actually repair it has already been spent. What this costs both people, not just him, is the version of the relationship that was still repairable months or years earlier, back when naming any single one of these 7 things directly would have cost far less than the silence that replaced it. On the ledger, time, which is the one resource in a relationship that doesn't wait patiently while a real need goes unaddressed. The earlier any of this gets named, the cheaper it is to actually fix. Add it all up and here's the full ledger. What a marriage actually requires to keep a good man fully invested in it: communication he doesn't have to decode, respect that doesn't erode by small degrees, intimacy that stays genuine instead of conditional, a real and trusted role in his own life, understanding for how he actually processes hard moments, trust instead of management, a partner invested in who he actually is rather than who a fantasy said he should be, and the willingness to name any of this early while it's still cheap to fix. Now, here's what you actually do with this. First, name what you need directly and specifically, rather than assuming a good partner should already know. Clarity costs you almost nothing and prevents most of the resentment that builds when it's missing. Second, know the difference between healthy, respectful feedback and chronic correction that quietly pushes you out of every role you could otherwise occupy, and say so plainly when you notice the second one happening. Third, treat intimacy and respect as things worth actively protecting in the relationship, not things you passively hope show up. If either one is being withheld conditionally, name that directly rather than absorbing it as normal. Fourth, ask explicitly for what kind of support you need in a hard moment. Listening versus solving, instead of assuming your partner should already know which one applies, and extend the same clarity back when it's her turn to need something specific from you. Fifth, notice when trust is being replaced by oversight, and say so calmly and directly. A relationship where your judgment is constantly second-guessed isn't a partnership functioning normally. It's one worth naming as something that needs to change. And sixth, evaluate your relationship against the real person in front of you, not against a cultural fantasy either of you absorbed before you ever met each other. The version of the relationship actually available to you might be less cinematic than the story and still be worth choosing deliberately on its own honest terms. And seventh, don't wait for a breaking point to name any of this. The earlier a real need gets voiced, the less it costs to actually address. Waiting until distance has already become the default in your relationship makes the same conversation far harder than it needed to be. None of this is about lowering your standards. It's about making sure the standards you're holding are actually yours, actually reasonable, and actually communicated, because a need that's never named is a need that never gets the chance to be met. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments. Which of these 7 has been the hardest one to get in your own relationship, and have you ever named it directly instead of just living with the absence of it? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this names something you've needed but never quite had the words for, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up, one entry at a time.